Dr. Susan Wolfenbarger, who works for the U.S. Department of State in Conflict and Stability Operations and was called unexpectedly to Guatemala to discuss war crimes prosecutions issues related to the conflicts there. But I am going to be here in her place, but also talking about what kinds of legal issues we actually have and what kind of legal remedies that we have to deal with the kinds of damage, destruction, and looting that you saw in Catherine's presentation, heard more about from Corey. I should say that Elizabeth told me that a lot of you are lawyers and would be interested in the law. And I certainly hope that's the case, because you're going to get a little bit of a legal dose here right before the reception. But there is wine on the backside, I promise. So I first want to give you a sense of what the U.S. legal regime looks like to protect cultural heritage. And it's spread not unexpectedly across many different departments and agencies. So USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance directs U.S. government disaster assistance spending. The Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs has legal jurisdiction over the 1970 UNESCO Convention, which is our primary legal instrument to deal with archaeological site looting. The U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor has legal jurisdiction over the destruction of religious sites and cemeteries. The National Park Service's Office of International Affairs deals with the 1972 UNESCO World Heritage Convention and the nomination and the preservation of sites on the International World Heritage List. The Smithsonian Institution's Undersecretary for Museums and Research deals with heritage disaster response, and the U.S. Department of the Department of Defense deals with the implementation of the 1954 Hague Convention. But there is some dispute right now in the Department of Defense over which office actually has a jurisdiction over the implementation over the Hague Convention, which is our primary legal instrument for protecting cultural heritage in armed conflict. But what I want to do for you right now, I mean, we could talk, or I could talk, and you don't want to hear me talk really, about all of these different agencies, and they're all very important roles in protecting cultural heritage. But I want to address something that's very immediate, something that we can do right now to address archaeological site looting. So I'm going to be focusing my comments specifically on the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and the implementation of the 1970 UNESCO Convention. So why this? And so I want to draw up this image again. This is from Dura Europos, and you saw this image before with Catherine. You can see this looted out Swiss cheese moonscape. We run out of adjectives as archaeologists to describe the kind of horror at the loss to knowledge and humanity that we see at sites like this. And to give you an idea, to expand on what Catherine said, Dura Europos is the site of the oldest known image of Jesus Christ. It's the site of the oldest known synagogue. And very small portions of this site were archaeologically excavated. Those are the straight lines. The holes are the looters' pits. This site is one you didn't see from Catherine, but imagery that Catherine helped to analyze. And this is looting at Mari, very famous for its cuneiform tablet library. And this image is from November 2014, and most of the looting at Mari took place between that March and that November 2014, after the area fell under ISIS control. And the looting here was incredibly intense. Up to 5.5 pits a day were dug at the site, which is actually a greater degree of intensity than what we saw in Iraq after the Second Gulf War. So how do we deal with looted material in the United States? How do we prevent ISIS-trafficked objects from entering U.S. commerce? And we have two ways of dealing with that. We have reactive law and proactive law. And so the reactive law imposes import restrictions on cultural property after it's been looted, after it's being seen en masse on the international market, and it involves a functioning foreign sovereign. So the expectation is that country will make a request of the United States to restrict the import of that commonly looted cultural property. But in a disaster situation, that oftentimes doesn't work. And so we turn to proactive law, specifically to reduce the incentive of armies or non-state actors like ISIS to loot for monetary gain. And it's what we need to do in situations where there isn't a functional sovereign that can't bring a request to the United States government. And so in these cases, we put import restrictions on cultural property before it enters the United States and before it becomes well known on the international art market. And so our reactive law is embodied in the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act of 1983. And so this is the bedrock for all cultural property preservation law related to archaeological site looting. But in terms of proactive law, we've done this on a country-by-country basis. So in 2004, we did this for Iraq. We tried the same in 2005 in Afghanistan, but the law did not pass. And we did this most recently in May of this year, the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act for Syria, and that act did pass. But there is a provision in the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act to deal with emergencies. And the emergency is that a lot of a particular kind of artifact is being looted, like a cuneiform tablet, and the president may exercise his authority to impose import restrictions. But you see that word from Princess Bride here. I don't think that means what you think it means, because emergencies under the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act involve the emergency of looting. They don't refer to the emergency of conflict. They don't refer to the emergency of a disaster. And so the president can only impose import restrictions when a country brings forth a proposal to enter into a memorandum of understanding for import restrictions under this law. And Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Mali, I can keep going down to Libya, are not at any kind of state to actually make those kinds of requests under our existing law. So the emergency actually doesn't apply to a disaster or a crisis of military nature or war or natural disaster. So these were some of the issues that we were faced in dealing with the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, and really trying to think through how we can better change and shape U.S. law to address the issue of archaeological site looting. And so there are 4 key provisions to it, which I'm just going to very briefly walk through. The first is that this law imposed import restrictions on cultural property removed from Syria on or after March 15, 2011, which is the date upon which the International Red Cross Red Crescent recognizes the Syrian conflict as becoming of an international character, a very key phrase in international law. And so the intention behind these import restrictions is to reduce the incentive for groups to loot by denying them a market. I mean, this isn't rocket science when it comes to actually how this functions. And also, this brings the U.S. into compliance with UN Security Council Resolution 2199, which called on all countries to impose import restrictions on Syrian cultural material. The second provision is that established a safe harbor for Syrian cultural property in the United States, which requires a presidential determination that it doesn't encourage looting by establishing a safe harbor at a museum. That is to say, to take in cultural property from Syria at places like the Smithsonian Institution or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York that would otherwise be destroyed by an entity like ISIS or by an entity like the Syrian government, that in effect the United States becomes a place of refuge for these objects, subject to the very strict condition that that activity doesn't encourage site looting. And crucially, this implements the first protocol of the Hague Convention for Syria. And that's unique in U.S. law. This is not true for any other country. But it brings the U.S. into greater compliance with international humanitarian law. Third, and because of that first slide I showed you of how spread out cultural property protection is across the U.S. government, we're in this very odd situation that we really don't know all the activities that the U.S. government does to